welcome to Practical Witch Talk. I'm your host, Friday Gladheart, author of the Practical Witches Almanac and instructor at Witch Academy. This podcast is about the Witch's New Year. This is Season 2, Episode 2. Thank you for joining me. So a recent social media post by a traditional witch I have a great deal of respect for sent me into a spin. This post was presented as an FYI that the Witch's New Year is on the winter solstice and not Samhain. A chorus of likes and 100% echoes followed, and the debate began with people starting to say that all Wiccan and witchcraft paths are just derivative of Gardnerian Wicca. Now, don't get me started on derivative practice, as witchcraft is modern, syncretic, and decentralized. Let's break that down real quick. When I say syncretic, I mean that our practice incorporates many different types of practices. When I say modern, it is with the admission that, of course, we draw from ancient tradition, folk magic, and many historical references, but overall it's a modern and evolving practice. Practical witches include the latest scientific studies in herbs and plants alongside the historical and folk correspondences. And I believe that if witches of the past had lighters, you can bet they'd be using them to light their ritual fires. As a side note, there are exceptions because we are talking about witches, and of course there is no one blanket rule. There's no one way. And there are a few that are practicing reconstructionism. So reconstructionists do try to adhere to historical practice without syncretically incorporating modern practices. So the elements are a good example of syncretic practice that a lot of us utilize. Earth, air, fire, and water were an ancient Greek concept devised by Empedocles, and it was later involved into the system of Aristotle. So we call these the classical elements, and utilize the earth, air, fire, and water concept into many of our ritual and energy work. Our rituals are sprinkled with practices from Western occultism, Masonry, the Golden Dawn, the OTO, and many other, depending on the preferences of individual practitioners and depending on the practices of specific traditions. But I digress. Back to the post telling all these newbie witches that the new year is the winter solstice and not Samhain. So, what concerned me the most on this was that the one way, and this way is the only way attitude that so many echoed in the comments. Witchcraft is decentralized. And unless you follow a specific tradition, our new year can be whenever you want it to be. For most witches, this is Samhain or the winter solstice. But I have met a few witches who celebrate at Imbolc as their new year. So arguments like this only divide our already underserved community, and although I do understand the need for some gatekeeping in specific traditions, throwing out a blanket rule of doctrine is simply not what witches are all about. In fact, many of us came to witchcraft as a way to explore our magic and our spirituality without an oppressive church. Please remember that witchcraft is decentralized. It has no peer overview. There's no authority that can tell you what you can and cannot do. And if someone attempts to do so, notice the red flag. You can tell I'm getting kind of a rant going on here. Conversely, if you are Alexandrian or Gardnerian, as where I began, if you're a dedicant, your specific tradition may have more exacting associations with the different Sabbats. And as a Gardnerian or Alexandrian or possibly other traditions, you'll probably be expected to follow them, at least in group rituals. Your private situation might vary. You would have to ask your high priest or high priestess, depending on the hierarchy of the tradition that you adhere to. But as informative posts like this start to spark discussion, they often spiral into division. Make a mental note of when this happens in groups. Be sharp. Who starts it? And who feeds the flames? Look for logical fallacies and arguments, and don't participate in the debate with people who have a my way is the only way approach. Let's say, you'll see people telling you that you shouldn't have specific names for your Sabbats. They'll tell you which Sabbat is real and which is made up, and so forth. And the bottom line is that the wheel of the year is yours. Your practice, your holidays, your Sabbats are yours. Many of us came to it in the 70s through the 90s, learning the 8 classic Sabbats. the 8 Wiccan Sabbats, some of the pagan groups will call now, but they're celebrated by lots and lots of people that aren't pagan as well. And these 8 Sabbats fit our needs, our lifestyle, and our practice as well. They're spaced fairly equidistant apart, and just when you're starting to really know that you need that ritual, you know that you need that space, another Sabbath comes up, and it's just great timing. We all learned this way, we've practiced this way, and it's a personal tradition. We have grandchildren and children now celebrating these 8 Sabbats with us. So do you want to be the one that goes over to a family's Mabon feast with 3 generations present and tell them that they shouldn't celebrate Mabon because Aidan Kelly made that name up? No, probably not. And if you do, well then no more mulled cider and mead for you on Mabon. As I watched this post deteriorate on the social media, a voice of reason came from Jason Menke. He's a blogger at Pantheos Pagan. If you're not familiar with big name pagans, BNPs, he said that it's a wheel and it can start whenever you want. And of course, the only participation in this debate that I had was to like and respond with 100% on his post, which made me chuckle. On that note, it seems like most of these spatting and arguing about which way is correct, most, not all, were identified as men. And even though there were a lot of arguments put back and forth, the tension was never diffused until a man, a big name pagan, came in and said it's a wheel and you celebrate whenever you want. Interesting, huh? Think about that. Anyway, in one of my original teachings when I was just starting out in about 84 or 86, I was told that the time period would be between Samhain and the winter solstice was like a time without a time, that it, because of the cold and the stillness, it was sort of like we were all on hold or in suspension. Think of Odin on the Yggdrasil tree or the Hanged Man in the tarot. Anyway, so New Year was a time period, and we began it on Samhain, and now I celebrate both Samhain and winter solstice and the secular New Year because I'm always down for a holiday, but you do you. On the Practical Witches Almanac, you'll usually notice that most years, we're in the 25th anniversary, but most years, I would say 90% of the time, the Wheel of the Year is displayed with Yule at the top. And I do that not because it's necessarily the new year for everyone, but because it follows the calendar pages in the almanac that begin in December of the previous year. So the 2022 almanac is going to have December 2021. And I want to make sure that the wheel corresponds to the calendar pages. So it's not a doctrine, it's a convenience for easier reference. So send me your comments, questions, rants, or suggestions through practicalwitch.com. This has been a production of Witch Academy in cooperation with Practical Witch LLC. You can support this podcast through Patreon and subscribe through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and other streaming services. A special thank you goes out to my patrons for their support. Becky, Lindsay, and Chris, and Arkansas's finest stores, Strange Brew Occult's shop in Fort Smith, and the Parlor Metaphysical store in Hot Springs. If you'd like to learn more about witchcraft, plants, or tarot, check out witchacademy.org, and blessed be.